Hello there, Ben Bowers, the Spirit Specialist, and I am here today to talk to you about Spearhead single grain Scotch whisky from the Loch Lomond Distillery. Now it says single grain on the label, but it's kind of single malt. A little bit confusing. Let me give you a bit of background information about the distillery that have produced this, and also how this whisky itself is made. Spearhead is a single grain Scotch whisky produced at the Loch Lomond Distillery in Alexandria. The distillery itself was established by the former owners of the Littlemill Distillery in 1964, with distilling commencing the following year, and operated fully until a brief closure in 1984. Glen Catrine Bonded Warehouses bought the distillery and resumed production in 1987, with grain whisky being made from 1993 onwards. Glen Catrine were brand owners of well-known budget spirit brands such as Glens Vodka and High Commissioner, and needed a bulk production facility to satisfy demand. In 1993, Loch Lomond was the only distillery in Scotland at the time producing both malt and grain whiskies from the very same site. In 2014, the distillery, along with Glen Scotia, which was also owned by Glen Catrine, was bought out by a private equity group, and focus was turned to a more premium single malt whisky production. An Asian buyout fund then purchased the group in June 2019. Normally, grain whiskies are made from cereals other than barley, corn, rye, wheat and so on. However, in the case of Spearhead, the spirit is actually made from malted barley. However, it can't be called a single malt whisky, as the spirit is distilled from a column still known as a coffee still. Nothing to do with a hot caffeinated drink, it's actually named after the designer who invented it, Aeneas Coffee. As such, Spearhead has to legally be dubbed a single grain whisky. It does not offer an age statement, but maturation takes place in ex-bourbon casks with finishing in virgin American oak barrels. Those barrels have been charred with both the traditional fire, but also infrared heating. While this sounds like a cool process involving lasers, it's actually a way to maintain a much more consistent charring across barrels. Spearhead single grain Scotch whisky is bottled at 43% ABV. There is some filtration taking place, and it is believed a small amount of colouring is used to maintain a consistency of colour across batches. So, I was very fortunate to be sent a full sample bottle. Now, I will be brutally honest. When I was told about Spearhead from the distributors, my initial reaction was, not sure about this. Now, Loch Lomond are a decent distillery. They have a couple of fantastic brands as part of their single malt range. It doesn't have a particularly good reputation, and that's more during the Glen Catrine days, where the single malt stocks really weren't looked after properly. When the private equity group brought them out in 2014 and they started to focus more on single malt production, there was a lot of work that needed to be done to kind of turn a lot of casks around, and Loch Lomond kind of struggles in it's not a particularly exciting brand or a distillery. The distillery it's not open to the public because it is a production facility in essence. I've been fortunate enough to actually have a tour around it during my days working with G&M, and technically it's absolutely fascinating. The amount of stills that they've got there and the variety of stills is really, on a technical level, wonderful to see and really good to kind of get in the ins and outs of it. But I've done a number of tastings with Loch Lomond, and it's a brand that doesn't really catch the imagination because it's solidly well made. The Loch Lomond 12-year-old there's nothing particularly outstanding about it, but it's very well made, very solid, dependable, not exciting, but just good. I love the Inchmower in 12-year-old. I think it's absolutely fantastic. The Inchmower I sort of struggle with a bit as a peated version. And that combined with some of the marketing that I was being shown, where it was all about breaking the mold, it was all modern, it was kind of hip, it was clearly aiming for younger people. Maybe I'm just getting too old, but it was one where it was like, this sounds a bit like All Mouth and No Trousers, it really does. But send me a sample. I wasn't expecting this size sample, to be honest, but send me a sample, I'll give it a go. If it tastes good, I'll bring it in and I'll sell it. And the clue is probably in the fact that I'm doing a video and it is available to purchase. So grain whiskey really gets a bad reputation, and I think it's because, everything is single malt whiskey. That's what it is. That's proper whiskey, that sort of thing. Grain whiskey is traditionally the sort of the filler in blends. Blended whiskey is a combination of malt whiskey, not necessarily from one distillery, but grain whiskey is, because of the continual process through column stills, it is sort of that gives you that bulk in a blend. So, in the bottle of Famous Grouse, 70, 80, maybe even more of that is a grain whiskey base, and the malt whiskey is kind of what gives the flavour. So grain whiskies really don't get a good reputation. However, single grain whiskies, the ones that I've come across, with the exception of one, Fantastic. It ages brilliantly. You can get like 40-year-old grain whiskies that are absolutely stunning. At a younger age, it does tend to have a bit more of a bite to it. Sometimes, you know, young grain whiskey that's not quite kind of balanced well enough, it has a slightly kind of almost metallic, slightly coppery taste. You know, if you've got like copper coins and you kind of lick your fingers, there's a slight element of that. But it has a vibrancy, it has a sort of almost a juiciness to it as well, which can work really, really well. The one grain whiskey that I've not enjoyed is Hay Club. It's a single grain whiskey because it's made from the Cameron Bridge Distillery that's owned by Diageo. And it's not a bad whiskey, it's just boring. There is absolutely nothing to it because it's basically a whiskey made for non-whiskey drinkers. So it doesn't have anything particularly offensive about it because it's trying to get people who wouldn't ordinarily drink whiskey to try something that sort of is whiskey in the very loosest sense in terms of a flavour profile. And this is what Spearhead's doing as well. There's no David Beckham involved in this. There's no kind of celebrities yet. But this is aiming to attract younger whiskey drinkers, people who aren't necessarily drinking whiskey. The bottle is, I mean, I love the bottle. The bottle is really cool. It really reminds me of like bourbon bottles, that sort of thing. It's very textured. You've got Spearhead down the side here. You've got these lines. It feels good in the hand. You know, the label goes on about, you know, traditionally malted. You know, it's got those buzzwords on there where it doesn't really tell you a lot about it. I mean, it's, you know, infrared and fire toasted barrels. Infrared sounds really cool. It's expensive, but it really does give you a consistency of charring across a range of barrels. On the back, there's very, very little about it. In the blurb on the website, it talks about cocktails as well. We'll go into that in a bit. Let's actually let me tell you what it tastes like. So, in honesty, you know, when it turned up, I was not expecting that much at all. But it did surprise me, and let me try and tell you why. So, let me just get the lid back on. So, on the nose, straight away, there's like a caramel element to it, but it's a slightly burnt. It's like the charred top of a creme brulee, that kind of caramel element. But overriding is, for me, American whiskey. There's that vanilla element to it. There's a slight spiciness to it. You know, honestly, if I had this blind, I would be thinking, it's an American whiskey. You know, maybe not a bourbon, possibly, but this to me screams out American whiskey, which is absolutely no bad thing. Now, there's no age statement on it. I don't know what the aging is. I'm imagining it's probably quite young, maybe 6 to 8 years, something like that. But there's a youthfulness on it, but there's a lovely kind of like almost sort of citrusy, but it's slightly orangey. It's less lemon and lime and more kind of like fresh orange peel on there. Along with caramel, butterscotch, and there's a nice kind of warming oakiness to it. There is a sharpness, you know, it's bottled at 43, and fair play to them for bottling at 43, because they could easily have done this at 40 and made this even more arguably drinkable or approachable, but, you know, 43, you are starting to get a little bit of heat coming on the nose as well, but it's really well balanced. Right, on the palate. And again, it really evokes American whiskey, but it's not quite as warming. You do get that scotchiness feel as well. Because don't forget, this is malted barley. This is malted barley in a coffee still. So there is a round, malty, kind of like, you know, Cheerios and milk. Not massively so, but there is definitely a maltiness in there. This very much comes across as I only drink Scotch, but I want to know what American whiskey's like. Or I only drink American whiskies and I'd like to know what a single malt like. This is actually like a really good entry point into, and the one I used to go for was the Benromach Organic, because it was a single malt, pot still, made in Benromach Distillery, that was matured in virgin oak casks. So matured the same way as a bourbon was. And that had the same, very similar elements to this in terms of, it had an American whiskey feel, but you also had that effect of using malted barley. So that oranginess comes through. There is a definite kind of fresh orange peel in there. The toffee, the sort of slightly charred caramel note, but there's more of a warming maltiness coming through as well, kind of like that kind of like slightly damp Cheerios, you know, Cheerios that have been sat in milk, but there's not too much milk in, so it's kind of soaked it up, made it a little bit soggy, so you get more of a malty feel. This isn't as rich as like an Ovaltine, but the malted barley element is definitely there. So if you're looking at this as a kind of like an introduction to whiskey for younger whiskey drinkers, this has much more than Hague Club. Hague Club kind of worked because there was bugger all to it. This is like the next level of okay, if you've had Hague Club and you like that, let's give you a grain whiskey, let's give you an approachable whiskey that actually has some flavour to it. I really like this because I really like American whiskies, which are there. It's a great kind of introduction to what both Scotch and American whiskies can offer. I think it's really, really good. I think the bottle looks great. I genuinely believe that if you bought this as a present for somebody that doesn't necessarily drink whiskey, or you're looking for something that's like it's a really funky bottle, for me in the shop I've got a lot of bottles that look amazing, but I make sure that what's inside them tastes really good as well. Because there is a lot of bottles out there that look fantastic and what's inside is not good at all. And this is, I think, very, very good indeed. It's coming in at $34.99 a bottle, which you might be thinking, well, that's a little bit steep. You know, this is a single grain, it's not a popular thing. But this is I would argue this is a premium single grain. This is a single grain whiskey that actually offers what the best of single grain can do. You know, you've got a youthfulness to it, but you've got, don't look at this as a single grain. A lot of people will go single grain, oh, it's going to be really harsh and really young because that's what a lot of young single grains are. No, this is single malt whiskey in all but name. It's just, it's not in a pot still, it's in a column still. You know, the ingredients are still the same, the process is kind of very similar, and it is giving a sort of a similar type of flavour profile as well. With the coffee still, you have these rectifying plates, and depending on where you put those plates depends on the kind of flavour profile that the new make spirit will give you. And clearly, Michael Henry, who's the master distiller, and his team have kind of worked to kind of go, right, what's the best we can get out of this with where these plates go? And it actually gives you a different expression. I think it's fantastic. Now, they do go on a lot about cocktails as well, and there will be some of you watching this going, whiskey, cocktails, oh God, get out of town. I don't want anything to do with that. But one of the interesting ones that they do mention on their website, and they talk about putting in old-fashioned, and yeah, old-fashioned this would work, because old-fashioned, traditionally an American whiskey, normally a rye whiskey, there's enough spiciness in this that would work in an old-fashioned. But they talk about doing a Clover Club. Now, Clover Club is one of my favourite cocktails of all time, an absolute classic. But Clover Club is a gin cocktail. A Clover Club traditionally is a double measure of gin, or whatever measure of gin that you want, raspberry syrup or like squished up raspberries, lemon juice, that's pretty much it. Oh, and an egg white, because you need that kind of like frothy edge. They, in their blurb, talk about try a Clover Club with Spearhead. I've never considered doing a Clover Club with whiskey. Tried one last night. Here is a picture of it. That's the end result. That was using a sample of raspberry syrup that I got from Tom Proud. So that's actually the Bristol Syrup Company raspberry syrup, and the egg white syrup that I have that's for sale with Giffard. So it was a little bit sweeter because I used the raspberry syrup to get that raspberryness, but then I also used the egg white syrup, which has simple syrup in as well. So it was probably a bit sweeter than you would necessarily want. And then 50 ml of this. And by God, it worked. It was absolutely brilliant. And it takes the Clover Club in a completely different direction. You get much more of a warming, rounded feel, but it works so well with that raspberry element. The fruitiness, that kind of zingy fruitiness of the raspberry, with the kind of like bite spice of this, along with that kind of round, warming maltiness. It was fantastic. It was such a good cocktail. So good, I made two. And I very rarely make two of the same cocktail whenever I'm doing them because I want to try new things and try something else. But this was brilliant. You know, taken one of my favourite cocktails of all time in a completely different direction and equally as good. It was, so I do heartily recommend it. Do try this in a cocktail and do try this in a Clover Club because it absolutely works. I was so impressed. So, price-wise, no objections at all. I think it's absolutely a fair price. I think if it was pushing 40, you might be pushing in luck a bit. But I think 35 quid, and if I can get it on some sort of deal at some point, maybe in the run up to Christmas, it'll be even better. But this, you know, looking at other whiskies that are around and about for like 30, 35 quid, this is more than comparable. Just because it doesn't have an age statement on it and it says single grain, it's not single grain. I need people to understand that you need to get that kind of association of single grain and what that is and what people think it is not this. This is a single malt apart from the still it was used in. It's malted barley, and that is giving you a lovely depth of flavour. If you like American whiskies and you drink Scotch, or the other way around, this absolutely will work. It will work in cocktails, it will work in bourbon cocktails, it will work in Manhattans, old fashions, the lot. It's incredibly versatile, it's incredibly drinkable. It is a really good introduction to what whiskey can offer, while actually giving you flavours and depth and complexity, unlike what a lot of these new brands are doing, these whiskies that are kind of like, oh, we're you know, introducing whiskey to non-whiskey drinkers and we're going for young people, like Hey Club. They don't taste of anything. There's just absolutely nothing there. They might as well be a gin or a vodka. There's basically a vodka because there's barely anything there. This has bags of flavour, but it's still approachable. There's nothing offensive in it. It's really, really good. Annoyingly good, because I was kind of expecting it to be quite disappointing. Like I say, all mouth and no trousers, the bottle looks good, the marketing is full of buzzwords, but the actual liquid inside is a bit, yeah, whatever. But no, fantastic stuff, absolutely brilliant. So it's on the shelf. It is available through the website, www.spiritspecialist.com, or pop in the shop. I have plenty of it to share with my customers, so you are more than welcome to have a try of it. I do recommend it, and yeah, highly recommended. Get yourself a bottle, it's great stuff. So that's me done. I shall see you at the next one. Cheers.